Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers. Continuing with part 2 of creating the roof for our spline wall, we'll actually add the geometry script to our spline wall in this tutorial, and then I'll show you how to generate static meshes for the roof so that you can use them in game. Let's get straight into it. Welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial on adding a roof to your spline wall. If you haven't done the earlier tutorial, then the playlist is linked in the description below, and so you need to do that first to have this freestanding roof geometry script. And you can either add this to your existing spline wall, or you can follow my earlier tutorials to build a spline wall as well. So this is where we got to in part 1. We've got this geometry script that generates a roof in the shape of a spline. What we want to do now is attach this to our spline wall system so that it puts the roof in the right location and at the right shape to match the wall. So let's go into our content browser and open up our, in fact, let's delete the geometry script we've got here so that we've got a blank canvas. Open up the content browser and open up your blueprint for your spline wall, and you'll have various elements in here in this sequence at the front that's going through and creating the splines and the pillars for the different parts of the spline wall. So what we'll do is at the end of this sequence we'll add another pin, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable. So if you do add variables, and it will be a boolean called create roof. So this is effectively a choice that the user has whether they want to create a roof for the spline wall or not. So we need to make that visible and editable, and we'll create a new category for this. So in the categories over on the right hand side, we'll create a category called roof. We'll be adding a few more variables here in a second. So we'll do that. Now you've created this new pin in the sequence, so drag off this, and what we will do is a branch, and this branch will be based on this new boolean of create roof. So drag that in, and if create roof is true, we want to add our geometry script to this spline wall. And all you need to do here is drag off true and say add child actor component. And we need to make sure this is the right class of child actor. So over here on the child actor class, go and type GS, and we want our geometry script roof class. And that's all we need to do in order to attach the geometry script to our spline wall. However, we obviously need to pass in some parameters in a minute. So let's just comment this. Say create roof if requested. And let's just compile and save this and see what's happening if we put in a new spline wall. So let's drag in a new spline wall here. Let's make this. So I'm using Alt to drag out new points. And let's do enclose room to make it a complete structure. And now if we do create roof, you see that it actually generates our geometry script. It's not the same shape at the moment because it's using its own spline, but at least we see that it's adding the geometry script, and you can see up in the outliner that there's a geometry script that's a child of the BP spline wall. If I uncheck create roof, it disappears. So at least we know that we're creating the roof when we select this and disabling it when we deselect it. So now what we need to do is we need to pass the spline from the spline wall into the geometry script along with the other variables that we set up. So let's do that next. So I've opened up the content browser, and if I now double click to open the geometry script roof, this is where we got to yesterday in creating this. What we need to do first of all is we need to get a reference to the parent spline mesh. So at the moment we're using this spline and these variables here. We need to get them from the parent. So what I'll do is I'll just drag this bit back a bit, the event on rebuild and the set dynamic mesh. And what we need to do next is we need to get the parent actor. So if we do get parent actor, that will be our spline wall. We need to cast that to BP spline wall, because that's the object type that the parent is, and we need to store that as a variable. So if you promote this to a variable, and we'll call that variable spline wall. So now we have the spline information, or the spline object. We can get the spline and other elements from that. So let's connect this here. And for now, let's just use the spline from here instead of the spline that we created in the dynamic mesh component. So go to the spline here and delete it. Drag out our spline wall reference. From here, if you do get spline at the bottom here, and then plug that into the spline for the convert spline to polypath. And let's tidy that up a little bit, move it over the top there, move that up a little bit. Okay, let's not worry about the other parameters at the moment. Let's compile and save, go over here, and if we now do create roof, we get a roof that is the right shape, although it's at the floor level because we haven't raised it up to the roof level yet. So we're getting there in terms of the spline wall being connected to the geometry script roof. What I want to do is, though, I now want to have the parameters that we created, things like the thickness and whether it's inside out or those sort of things. I want those to be now in the spline wall rather than the geometry script roof. So let's go back to our geometry script. Here are our three user editable variables: roof thickness, inside out, and roof UV scale. So let's duplicate those in the spline wall, and then we'll get them from there when we go through the geometry script. So go back to the spline wall. Let's add the variables that we need. So roof thickness was a float. And I'm going to drag these all up into the roof category as I do them. Add another one, variable. This is the inside out option. That's a Boolean. And again, drag that up into the roof category. And then the last one was, let me just check, the roof UV scale, which was a float. So add another variable, roof UV scale, user editable, this is the float, and again put it into the roof section. And again, I'm just going to reorganize these so that they're in the same order. So we've now got the create roof option, and then the three variables: roof thickness, inside out, and roof UV scale. Let's compile and save that. In fact, let's set the default values as well. So the roof thickness we'll set to 50, inside out unchecked, and roof UV scale to 1. Compile and save. And now what we need to do is update our geometry script to use these variables instead of the ones in the geometry script. So come down here and let's now delete these three variables. It'll say it's in use, but that's fine. Inside out, yep. Roof UV scale, delete, yep. So what we're going to do now is take our spline wall reference, And if I type inside out, we can get inside out from the spline wall, and we'll plug that into this flip orientation. The height is the roof thickness, so let's get the spline wall again, get roof thickness, and plug that into the height of our polygon. And then finally we had the UV scale, which was this scale X and scale Y. So last thing we need to do is again get the spline wall object reference, get roof UV scale, and plug that into the X and the Y. So we now have the parameters from the parent object. If we compile and save, test this out. So now if we do things like go down to the roof, if we change the roof thickness to something like 500, you can see that it now goes from the floor all the way up. If I do inside out, it changes the orientation, and roof UV scale will test out once we apply the material in a minute. But let's do one other quick thing here. We need to make sure that the roof is actually at the roof location rather than on the floor. So put this back to 50. Let's make the height of this roof the height of the main wall mesh. So to do that, let's go back to the spline wall first of all, and let's store a variable. If you remember, at the start of the spline wall, we calculated the length of the mesh by getting a bounding box on the existing wall mesh. What we can also do is take the Z value of that bounding box, which is the height, and promote it to a variable, and we'll call this variable mesh height. And if we compile and save that, we can now go into the geometry script, and if you see where we append the polygon, we have a transform attribute here. If we just split that and split the location again, so that we have let's move these down, so that we now have the X, Y, and Z location. What we can do is we can plug the mesh height into the transform location Z. So by getting our spline wall, get that new variable we just created, get mesh height, and we will plug that into the Z value. Do a compile and save, and now you can see that the roof is placed on top of the spline, and it should change as we adapt it. So if I take one of these spline points and move it, you can see that the geometry script regenerates the roof with the relevant values, thickness, and puts it at the top of the roof. So far it's working pretty well. So what we need to do next is we need to sort out the material so that the roof inherits the material of the spline mesh as well. Setting the material on our roof is pretty straightforward. If we go to our geometry script, go to the end of the nodes, we can do a set material node, and we want to set it on the dynamic mesh component. So this needs a material input. We want to get the material from the spline wall main mesh. So drag in our spline wall reference, do get wall mesh, and from this we can do get material. In fact, it's not that one. So make sure you get the right node, get material, it's this static mesh, get material. And then all you need to do is plug the material output here into the material input of the dynamic mesh component. And that means that whatever you use for your spline wall, main mesh, the same material will be applied to the roof. So now if we compile and save, you can see that we now have a brick roof as well, although now we can see the UV scale is not right, so we can test out our UV scale parameter here. So if we change that, make it 20, and you can see that now has bricks that are roughly the same UV scale as the side. In fact, they're slightly larger, so maybe I should make it 25. But you can see that the adjustments are working here, so that's all good. One other thing we should do here as well is we should give the user some control over the roof position. At the moment, it's just placing this on top of the spline wall. We might want to scale it up. We might want to sink it slightly lower or raise it up if it's thicker. You can also see that there are some slight gaps in here. That's based on that error tolerance value that I mentioned when we create the, I'll show you what I mean. When we created the path, we had this error tolerance here. So if you want to get it more closely following curves in certain situations, you can change that value. So let's put in another value here for the roof transform so that our user can do some fine tuning of scales and offsets. So let's go back to the spline wall and we'll add a new variable, which I'm going to call roof transform. This is going to be a transform value and user editable, and again we want that to be in the roof category. So I'm going to drag it up here and I'm going to put it as the last variable in that roof category. So compile and save. Now we need to make use of that. So go to the geometry script for the roof, and where we did the transform here, what we're going to do now is let's just move, and in fact leave that there, the mesh height. Over here where there's a bit of space, do drag in your spline wall, get the roof transform, split that up into its relevant components, split the location up into the X, Y, and Z, and let's start plugging things in here. So let's plug the X and Y into the X and Y of the extrude polygon. Let's plug the rotation into the rotation, the scale into the scale. And now what we want to do is we want to add the mesh height to our Z. So if you come out of here and do a plus for addition, we'll add the mesh height and then we'll put that into the Z. It's a little bit messy at the moment, so you'll probably have to do a little bit of tidying up. Let's move these down out of the way so at least we can see what's connected to what, but I'll leave you to do the tidying up yourself. However, now we have the ability to change things like scale and the position, the finer position of the roof. So let's compile that, save, do a save of everything here. And now if we select our spline wall, we have this roof transform here. So it's already applied the mesh height. Say we wanted to sink this lower into the spline, we could do something here like, so it's a roof of thickness of 50. Let's do minus 50. And you see that that's now in line with the top of the spline wall. If we want it sunk slightly, we could do minus 60. We've got a slightly sunken roof there now, you can see. We can also do scaling as well. So let's, if we put that back up a little bit, let's put that up to minus 30. So it just sticks out a little bit. What we can do is we can up the scale slightly. So let's just do 1.05, 1.05. And you can see that it has scaled the roof slightly. Now, there's no easy way to work out the center position. So what we now need to do is change the location slightly here. So maybe we could do minus 50, or 0 here, and then just eyeball it to see if the overhang's what we want. Yeah, as you can see, we need to move it slightly like that. Maybe make it a little bit wider on the y-axis. But you have controls now, so you don't have to put up with the roof in its default position. You can scale and move things around as you want to get overhanging roofs. And you could even, if you have slightly skewed or uphill elements here, you can rotate, although this is really designed, this roof system, for flat roofs on level structures. So anyway, let's reset this back to its original values. Sink in a bit more. And let's have a look at play testing this and see what it looks like. So let's put a door in here so we can go inside. Go to our door mesh. And let's put that somewhere where we can see it. Okay, and let's go into play mode. Okay, and we can see that the ceiling is there. And that might give you a sense of confidence. Don't worry about the scaling on the door mesh. I just haven't set that to the same UV scale. But I'll show you the problem that we need to address next. If I go into, I was using play and editor there. If I go into standalone game, play mode, you will see that there is no roof. And this is because the roof is still a dynamic mesh, and dynamic meshes don't exist in the game. We need to convert that dynamic mesh into a static mesh so that it can be cooked and built into the game. So in the final part of this tutorial, we'll show you how to create a static mesh in the geometry script and then apply it to the spline wall so that it will exist in game. All right, let's start by setting up the elements on the spline wall. If you open your spline wall, we'll need to add a few more variables in our roof category. So click on new variables and we will do a Boolean for generate roof static mesh. We'll create another variable, generated roof static mesh. So this will be set once we've generated it, so we don't generate it again until we decide we want to clear it and try it again if we've changed it. So again, that's user editable. And we'll need two other fields where for the path and the name of the asset. So we'll do asset path. This will be a name field, and we'll do, in fact, just duplicate that with Control D, and we'll call this asset name. And then let's put all of these into the roof category. And the last one. Okay, and then let's just reorder them. So we'll do, in fact, that's the order I want. So generate roof static mesh, generated roof, which is some feedback to the user once it's done, asset path and asset name. In fact, I think I want those as strings. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll create a new component in here. Let's just compile and save to make sure everything's okay. We'll add a new component to the spline wall, and it's going to be a static mesh component. and I'm going to call it roof static mesh, and we'll leave that blank. So this will be set once we generate this roof, and if we don't want the roof, it'll be cleared out for us as well. So next thing we need to do is we need to create a function in here that sets that static mesh. So go up to your functions, create a new function called set roof static mesh, and we'll have an input here that is called roof mesh, and that will be a static mesh component. So go down here until you see static mesh object reference and use that. And then what we'll do is we'll drag in this roof static mesh component, drag off there and do set static mesh. We will connect it from the roof mesh input to the new mesh, and then last thing I want to do is once we've set that, we want to set our generated roof static mesh to say that it's been generated. So use Alt to drag that out, and then set this to checked so that the item has been generated. And let's just check our default values on here. So generate roof static mesh is blank. That's right. We'll tick that when we want to generate the static mesh. That's blank as well because we haven't generated. Asset path and asset name will be blank. We'll decide where we want to store those. So that's all good. Okay, so we've done everything we need to do in the spline wall for now. Now in the geometry script, we're going to respond to if that generate roof static mesh is checked. We'll generate it similar to what we did with the tunnel a couple of videos ago. And then once we've created our static mesh, we'll send the static mesh to this function here to set it in the parent. So switch over to your geometry script here. And if you go to the event graph, let's start tidying this up slightly. At the beginning, we were just getting the parent actor and setting that. So let's move that back a bit. And then what we'll do is we will do a sequence here. So let's do sequence. First thing I'm going to do is generate our mesh. So let's just put a comment around all of this bit here. And we'll say generate roof dynamic mesh. And then what we'll do is we will, once that's generated, we'll see if we want to generate the static mesh, and we'll do that. So from here, let's do a branch node. And the condition is going to be actually a couple of things. So the main thing is, do we want to generate the static mesh? So if we take our spline wall out, get generate roof static mesh, and that's really what we want to check to see if we want to generate it or not. However, I also want to make sure that we haven't generated it already, because if we've generated it, we don't want to keep generating it over and over again. So let's also drag out the spline wall and look at the generated roof static mesh. And what we want to do is we want to generate the static mesh if the generate roof static mesh is yes, and the generated roof static mesh is not yes. So let's put a not on here. So not a not equal, we want a not Boolean. And then we want to do an and Boolean between the two. So now we'll only go beyond this point if we want to generate it and we haven't generated it already. Okay, so from true, we now want to call a function to generate that. So we'll come back to this in a second. Let's create the new function first. And I'm going to call that generate static mesh. And this is going to be very similar to what we did when we did our tunnel tutorial a couple of videos ago. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our dynamic mesh and drag off there and do create new static mesh asset from mesh. So connect that, and that requires a few inputs there. So we need the asset path and name together. So actually, I wonder if I can split this. No, I can't. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll do it as we did before. We will take the, well, we need the asset path, so that's in the spline wall. Asset path. And while we're here, we'll drag out spline wall and get asset name as well. And now we just have to append everything together. So if you do an append here, we'll actually connect this here. And if you remember, we start off with /game/ then the asset path. And in the previous video, I did this with multiple appends, but one of my viewers pointed out you can actually just do all the appends in one append string. So let's just add another pin, and we'll do /, and then add another pin, and we'll put in the asset name. So this one append string creates the whole path, game, asset path, / asset name, and we can now plug that into the asset path and name. Now we also need to consider our options when we're creating the static mesh as well. So if you drag off here and do make geometry script static mesh options, again we want to do similar things we did for the tunnel. So you can enable nanite if you want, and then choose your nanite settings. Whether you enable collision or not is up to you. If you've got roofs that are always above you and you're never going to stand on the roof, then you don't need to do that. But let's assume you're able to leap from building to building. So we want to enable collision and make it use a complex collision as simple, so it will adhere to those curves. Okay, so now we've created the static mesh, we also need to set the material for this mesh as well. So drag off from success, do set material. I want to make sure you use the static mesh one. Drag the static mesh asset and connect it to there. And the material we want is the material that's already applied to the dynamic mesh component. So if you do a get material up here from the dynamic mesh component, you remember we set that to the wall mesh when we were creating it dynamically. So it should be set to the same as the spline wall, and we can use the return value and put it in here. Okay, so now we have a static mesh that's been created, the material set correctly. The last thing we need to do is set it in our spline wall static mesh component that we set up a few minutes ago. So last thing we'll do is take our spline wall, use the set roof static mesh function that we created, and it's expecting a roof mesh as an input, so we can take the static mesh asset output from here, plug it in there. Let's just put a reroute node so we can see where it's coming from, and we're pretty much done now in terms of creating the function to create the static mesh. The only thing is we haven't connected this generate static mesh in the main event graph. So let's go back here, and where we did our check whether we want to generate a mesh, we now need to take this and do generate static mesh. And let's give that whole set of nodes a comment to say generate static mesh if requested. Okay, and let's just check that we have done everything we need to do here. Looks good. Let's do a quick test out. So come out of here, and let's select this, and we should have some extra parameters here. So now we have this generate roof static mesh, asset path and name. So let's give it an asset path and an asset name. If I look in my content browser, I had a folder called My Models. So let's put it in there. So I'm going to call the asset path My Models, and let's call the asset name Test Roof. Okay, right, well, let's give it a go. So we'll click on Generate Roof Static Mesh, and you can see that the generated roof static mesh has been ticked as well. That should have only happened once the loop was complete from the geometry script and back to the spline wall. If we look at our roof static mesh component here and go up to the static mesh and element, you can see that now the static mesh component has the test roof component with the right material. And we can even check, if we go into the My Models, you'll see there is the test roof static mesh. We can have a look at it. That looks right. Now, one major thing I've noticed here is that when it generates static meshes, or when you do merge actors, which you might want to do as well, it doesn't actually save the components. And I've found it's pretty important to do Control-Shift-S straight away. Otherwise, you might notice down the line things get a little bit wacky. I've noticed sometimes that if it tries to regenerate things that are unsaved, then you can get some errors. They never corrupt your project. You can always just delete the static mesh and regenerate it. They just cause you a little bit of inconvenience. So get into the habit when you generate static meshes or merge actors to do Control-Shift-S to get everything saved onto your disk. Right, so now we have that. I mean, it doesn't look any different here, but I'll show you the benefit now. First of all, if we go into play mode, I've left it in standalone game mode. That was the thing that was causing a problem a second ago. So if I go into play mode, we now have a roof over our head. Now we have the static mesh. So that's good. That's now working. And if you're happy with let me come out of here. If you're happy to have the spline mesh components and this static mesh in your game, you can carry on like that. But if you remember, I showed you in an earlier video how you might want to collapse your spline wall into a merged actor for your final game. Well, now you've got this static mesh component, you can do that even with the roof. So if we click on this and do actor merge actor, I'll show you in the merge actor settings, you'll see that we have as well as the wall segments, the door and any other segments there, we now have the test roof as well, roof static mesh. So if we merge this together, you'll have the whole building with the roof as one mesh. So that will work nicely. Okay, there's one final thing we need to do here. If we want to get rid of that static mesh, let me show you what might happen if you want to do some amendments. So if I drag this out here, you can see that it's generating the it's generating the dynamic mesh here for the roof, but it's still got the static mesh here. That's why you're seeing that sort of Z fighting there. I mean, it doesn't cause you a problem except for the fact that it's a little bit ugly when you're doing your editing. If you actually make it smaller, that's kind of worse because the static mesh is overhanging your work here. So what we need to do is we need to create another function that allows us to clear the static mesh if we want to regenerate it again. All right, so go back into your spline wall blueprint, up to the functions, and let's create a new function, which we will call clear roof static mesh. And here we will take our roof static mesh component, do a set static mesh on it, but leave it blank. So that will remove the static mesh from this component. And we now want to reset our generate roof static mesh and generated roof static mesh booleans so that if in the future we want to generate it again, we can do so. So let's just use Alt to drag these out, generate and generated. connect these together. So we want to set generate roof static mesh to unchecked, and the same for generated. And that means once we make changes, we can generate it again. So let's do compile and save. And let's come, oh, and we need to make this function. If you go back to the clear roof static mesh function, we want to make it call in editor so that the user can click on it, and we'll put that in the roof category. Compile and save. Let's save everything with Control-Shift-S. And if we go over here, you will see if you go down to the roof category, we have this clear roof static mesh function. So you can see at the moment, I've got both the static mesh here and the dynamic mesh fighting with each other. If I do the clear roof static mesh, that static mesh disappears. And it's reset the generate and generated checkboxes. If I want to just double check, go to the roof static mesh, and you'll see that the static mesh is empty now. So what we can do now is we can make some changes. So we can make it larger here. Maybe we want to make this a sharp edge on this side. So I'm using Shift-T to make some sharp edges. Okay, looks good. I want to make it a static mesh again so that I can play it in my game. So what I will do is go down to the roof section, click on generate roof static mesh. It says it's been generated. And if I look at roof static mesh just to make sure, sure enough, test roof is now in there. And if I go into the game, let's save before I go in there. And again, I'm doing it from the standalone game to make absolutely sure. And that's all good. So our new roof is now a static mesh and shows up properly in the game. So that's the end of today's tutorial. I wanted to also leave you with a thought that if you wanted to do a floor is effectively the same mesh. So what you could do is you could use this logic and simply just have a floor checkbox as well. And all you would do there is set the transform to the floor level. You might want them as separate meshes if you wanted a roof that overhangs and a floor that doesn't, but you've got all the logic now to do that. You can just duplicate that to suit your circumstances. So I hope you've found this two-part tutorial useful. Stay subscribed, and we'll be covering more geometry scripts in the upcoming tutorials. So see you in the next one. Bye for now.